ballroom of Ashworth Manor glittered with candlelight, but nothing in the room shone as coldly as the man standing near the tall windows. Duke Alexander Ashworth stood apart from the crowd, his dark coat perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable. People often said that looking at him was like looking at a closed door. No one truly knew what lay behind it, and very few dared to try the handle. He was 29 years old, and already his name carried more weight than most men twice his age. Servants lowered their eyes when he passed. Lords hesitated before speaking to him. Ladies fluttered their fans and whispered about his fortune, his sharp jaw, his unmarried status, but always from a safe distance. There was something about him that made people careful, not because he was cruel. He never raised his voice, never mistreated anyone openly, but there was a stillness in him, a control so complete that it unsettled those around him. It was as if he had built a wall inside himself, brick by brick, over many years, and dared the world to try and climb it. Tonight was one of the grand social evenings that filled the London season. Dozens of candles, silk gowns, polished shoes tapping across marble floors, and conversations that meant less than they pretended to. The Duke attended these gatherings out of duty, not desire. He would arrive, speak a few necessary words, and leave before the night grew too loud, predictable, controlled, just as he liked it. He did not expect the evening to be any different. He did not expect her. Eleanor Whitfield had not wanted to attend the ball at all. She was not a guest in the usual sense. She was there because Lady Marigold, the elderly aunt of the household she served, insisted that her governess accompany her for the evening, mostly to keep watch over her energetic grandchildren, who liked to wander into places young children should not wander. Eleanor was 24, poised and intelligent, but she carried herself with the quiet caution of someone who had learned, at a young age, that attention could bring trouble as easily as kindness. She had lost her parents early in life, and after that, life had taught her to observe more than to speak. She noticed things others missed: a nervous glance, a forced smile, an unspoken tension between two people standing too politely apart. Tonight, she noticed the Duke, almost immediately. Not because of his handsome face, though it was hard not to notice that too, but because of the way the entire room seemed to shift slightly whenever he moved, like water making space for a stone dropped into it. Her world was made of children's lessons, quiet corners, and long nights reading by candlelight. She turned her attention back to her charge, a lively 6-year-old girl named Cassandra, who was determined to sneak toward the dessert table for the third time that evening. "Cassandra," Eleanor said gently, catching the girl's small hand before she could dart off again. "Sweets are for later, after supper. Come, let us sit for a while." "But I'm not tired," Cassandra protested, her eyes wide with the stubbornness only small children seem to master so well. Eleanor crouched slightly, meeting her eyes. "I know, but even lively girls need to rest their feet sometimes, or they turn to jelly." Cassandra giggled at that, momentarily forgetting the sweets, and allowed herself to be led toward a quieter corner of the room. It was a small victory, the kind Eleanor collected often in her work. Not grand, not remarkable, but meaningful in its own way. It was in searching for a quiet corner that fate, or perhaps simple bad luck, placed her directly in the Duke's path. She did not see him until it was almost too late. Turning with Cassandra's hand in hers, she stepped back just as he stepped forward, and though neither of them touched, the near collision was enough to draw the attention of those standing close by. A few heads turned. A murmur passed through the small circle of nearby guests, the kind of murmur that always followed anything involving the Duke, however small. "Forgive me," Eleanor said quickly, straightening. Her voice was calm, though her heart had jumped slightly at the suddenness of it. "I did not see you there, Your Grace." The Duke studied her for a moment before responding. It was not an unkind look, but it was thorough, the look of a man used to assessing situations quickly and completely. "You were not looking where you were going," he said simply. His voice was low, controlled, carrying just enough volume to be heard without being raised. "I was looking after my charge," Eleanor replied, glancing briefly at Cassandra, who was staring up at the tall, imposing man with open curiosity. "Children do not always walk in straight lines, Your Grace." It was a small thing to say, perhaps too small to matter, but there was something in her tone, not disrespectful, but not entirely submissive either, that made the Duke pause. Most people, when speaking to him, either fell into nervous silence or overcompensated with excessive politeness, showering him with unnecessary apologies. This woman had done neither. She had simply stated a fact, calmly, as though speaking to any other person in the room. He was not used to that. "And do you often let children set the pace of a room full of adults?" he asked, his tone still even, though there was the faintest edge of challenge in it now, like a test being placed quietly on a table. Eleanor met his gaze directly, something few people in that ballroom would have dared to do. "I let them be children, Your Grace. There will be time enough for adult manners later." A few nearby guests exchanged glances, clearly startled by the boldness of her reply. Speaking so freely to the Duke of Ashworth was not something people did, not without consequence. The air around them seemed to grow slightly more still, as though the room itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The Duke's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of interest, quickly hidden away. He was not used to being spoken to as though he were simply another guest at the ball, rather than a man whose displeasure could shape the course of someone's future. He found himself, briefly, unsure of how to respond, an unfamiliar and unwelcome feeling. "You speak boldly for someone in your position," he said finally, his voice quieter now, meant only for her ears, though a few close by still caught the words. Eleanor felt a small twist of nervousness in her stomach, but she did not let it show. She had learned long ago that showing fear rarely helped a difficult situation. "I speak honestly, Your Grace. I did not think honesty required a certain rank to be permitted." There was a pause, a long one, long enough that Cassandra, sensing the tension, though not understanding it, tugged gently on Eleanor's hand. The Duke studied Eleanor for a moment longer, his sharp eyes taking in details most people would miss. The steadiness of her hands despite the situation, the calm set of her shoulders, the way she held herself not with arrogance, but with quiet self-respect. It was rare, he thought, to meet someone who did not seem to want something from him: money, favor, attention. She seemed, instead, entirely focused on the small girl beside her. "Do not challenge me," he said at last, his voice low and even, though there was something unreadable beneath the calm surface of it. It was not spoken as a threat exactly, but as a statement of fact, the way one might warn another about the danger of touching a hot stove. A simple truth, offered without malice, but firm nonetheless. The words landed heavier than perhaps he intended. Eleanor felt something in her chest tighten, and for one long moment, she did not know what to say. Around them, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into the background, as though the two of them stood in a small, silent bubble apart from the rest of the world. She froze. Not out of physical fear exactly. He had not raised his voice, had not moved toward her in any threatening way. But there was something in the quiet certainty of his tone that unsettled her far more than shouting would have. It was the voice of a man completely confident in his own control. Someone who never doubted that his words carried weight, because they always had. For a moment, Eleanor considered simply lowering her eyes, murmuring an apology, and walking away, as anyone in her position likely would have done. It would have been the safe choice, the expected choice. But something in her, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps simple exhaustion with a lifetime of staying quiet, refused to let her do so entirely. "I did not mean to challenge you, Your Grace," she said slowly, her voice steady, despite the tightness in her chest, "only to speak the truth as I see it. If that offends you, I am sorry for it, but I will not apologize for caring for the child in my charge." The Duke's eyebrows lifted, ever so slightly, the smallest crack in his otherwise perfectly composed expression. Around them, a few guests who had been listening exchanged startled glances, clearly unsure whether they had just witnessed something remarkable or something dangerous. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of the Duke's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, gone as quickly as it appeared. "You are either very brave," he said quietly, "or very unwise." "Perhaps both, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, some of her earlier composure returning now that the worst of the tension seemed to have passed. He studied her for one more long moment, something calculating behind his gaze, as though he were solving a puzzle he had not expected to encounter that evening. Then, without another word, he gave a small, formal nod and turned, moving back into the crowd, as smoothly as he had appeared, leaving Eleanor standing there, with her heart still pounding, and Cassandra looking up at her, with wide, curious eyes. Miss Eleanor, the little girl whispered, tugging her sleeve. Was that man angry with you? Eleanor let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, forcing a small, reassuring smile onto her face for the child's sake. No, sweetheart. I do not think he was angry. Just surprised, perhaps. But even as she said the words, she was not entirely certain they were true. Something had passed between them in that brief exchange. Something she could not quite name, but that lingered uncomfortably in her chest long after the Duke had disappeared into the crowd. Across the room, the Duke found a quiet space near the windows once more, his mind unusually occupied. He was a man who prided himself on order, on predictability, on the careful control he exercised over every aspect of his life. He had built that control over many years, through loss and hardship that few people knew the full details of, and he protected it fiercely. And yet, in the span of a few short minutes, a governess, with steady eyes and an unshaken voice, had disrupted that careful order more than anyone had in a very long time. He told himself it meant nothing, a momentary irritation, quickly forgotten. By morning, he would not think of her at all. But even as the thought crossed his mind, some quiet, unfamiliar part of him doubted it was true. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully on the surface, polite conversations, careful smiles, the usual dance of social obligation. But both Eleanor and the Duke found their thoughts returning, more than once, to that brief and unexpected exchange by the ballroom floor. Neither of them yet understood what it meant. Neither of them could have guessed how much it would come to matter. For now, it was simply a warning spoken, and a moment of frozen silence in return. The first quiet spark of something neither of them was prepared for. 3 weeks had passed since the night of the ball, and Eleanor had almost convinced herself that the strange encounter with the Duke of Ashworth had faded into an unimportant memory. Almost. There were moments, quiet ones, when she was reading by candlelight, or walking through the gardens with Cassandra, when his voice returned to her without warning. Do not challenge me. The words had not been cruel, yet they had settled into her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she could not quite calm. She told herself it did not matter. Dukes and governesses did not cross paths again after a single evening. Their worlds were too different, too far apart, for anything more than that one accidental meeting. And so she pushed the memory aside, focusing instead on her daily duties. Lessons in the morning, walks in the afternoon, and the simple, steady rhythm of caring for a household that was not her own, but had, in its own way, become a kind of home. That fragile peace ended on a quiet Tuesday morning, when Lady Marigold called Eleanor into the drawing room, with an expression Eleanor had never seen on the older woman's face before, a mixture of worry and careful hope. "Sit down, my dear," Lady Marigold said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Her voice was gentle, but there was a tension beneath it that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with unease. "Is something wrong, my lady?" Eleanor asked, taking the seat carefully. Lady Marigold folded her hands in her lap, choosing her words with visible care. "You know that my late husband left certain debts behind when he passed. I have managed as best I could, but recent circumstances have made things difficult. There is a matter that requires resolving, and it involves the Duke of Ashworth." Eleanor felt her chest tighten at the mention of his name. "The Duke, my lady?" "Yes." Lady Marigold sighed, looking suddenly tired. "It seems my husband borrowed a rather significant sum from the Ashworth estate many years ago, before his passing. I was unaware of the full extent of it until recently. The Duke has been more than patient, but the debt must be addressed, and I simply do not have the means to repay it as swiftly as required." "What does this mean for us, my lady?" Eleanor asked carefully, though a small, uneasy suspicion was already forming in her mind. Lady Marigold hesitated before continuing. "The Duke has offered an arrangement, rather than demand immediate repayment, which would be a great hardship for this household. He has proposed that Cassandra and her brother, Master Edmund, continue their education under his roof for a period of time, with proper staff and tutors provided. It would ease the financial burden considerably, and the children would still receive an excellent education." Eleanor's mind raced, already understanding where this was leading, though she did not yet want to believe it. "And what of their governess, my lady?" Lady Marigold met her eyes, something apologetic in her expression. "The Duke has specifically requested that you accompany the children, given how attached they have become to you, and given your evident skill in managing them." He believes continuity would be best for their education and comfort. For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. She thought of the ballroom, of the low, even voice warning her not to challenge him, of the strange, unreadable look in his sharp eyes. The idea of living under his roof, of seeing him daily, filled her with a complicated tangle of emotions she did not have the time or the composure to fully examine. "I understand, my lady," she said finally, her voice steady despite the unease inside her. "If this arrangement helps ease your burden and keeps the children comfortable, I will do as is needed." Lady Marigold reached out and took her hand gently. "I am sorry to ask this of you, my dear. I know it is not an easy thing, to leave a settled position for an uncertain one. But I promise you, the Duke, whatever his reputation, is not a cruel man. Strict, yes. Exacting, certainly. But not cruel." Eleanor nodded, though privately she was not entirely certain she agreed. She remembered the stillness in his eyes, the quiet authority in his voice. He had not been cruel that night, true. But there had been something in him that unsettled her far more than simple unkindness would have. A sense of complete and total control, as though nothing in his life was ever allowed to happen by accident. And now, it seemed, she was about to step directly into the center of that control. The arrangements were made quickly. Within a week, Eleanor found herself packing her few belongings into a modest trunk, saying careful goodbyes to the household staff, who had become familiar faces over the past 2 years, and preparing Cassandra and Edmund for the journey ahead. "Are we really going to live in a castle?" Cassandra asked excitedly, bouncing slightly on her toes as the carriage was loaded outside. "It is a manor house, not quite a castle," Eleanor corrected gently, though she could not help the small smile that tugged at her lips at the child's enthusiasm. "But yes, it is very grand, from what I understand." Edmund, older and more reserved than his younger sister, said little, though Eleanor noticed the way his hands gripped the edge of his coat sleeves, a small sign of nervousness he was trying to hide. She crouched slightly to meet his eyes. "It will be all right, Edmund," she said softly. "New places can feel strange at first, but you will have your lessons, your sister, and me, just as before. Nothing important will change." He nodded, though his expression remained uncertain, and Eleanor felt a small pang of sympathy for him. Change was never easy, especially for a boy of 10 who had already lost so much in his young life. The journey to Ashworth Manor took the better part of a day, the carriage rolling steadily through the countryside as the scenery shifted from familiar town streets to wide, rolling green fields, and finally to the long, tree-lined drive that led up to the manor itself. Eleanor had heard descriptions of the Duke's estate before, but nothing had quite prepared her for the sight of it in person. The manor rose before them, tall and imposing, built of pale gray stone that seemed to catch and hold the afternoon light. Rows of tall windows lined its front, and neatly trimmed gardens stretched out on either side, disappearing into the distance. It was beautiful, in a cold, formal sort of way. Every hedge trimmed with precision, every path laid out with careful, deliberate order. It reminded her, uncomfortably, of the man who owned it. They were greeted at the entrance by the household's head housekeeper, a kind-faced older woman named Mrs. Whitmore, who welcomed the children warmly and led them inside with brisk efficiency. Eleanor followed, taking in the grand entrance hall, the high ceilings, the portraits lining the walls of ancestors long since passed. "His Grace is currently occupied with estate matters," Mrs. Whitmore explained as she guided them through the halls. "But he has asked that you be shown to your rooms and made comfortable. He will meet with you properly this evening, before supper." Eleanor nodded, grateful, in a strange way, for the brief reprieve. She was not entirely certain she was ready to face the Duke again so soon, though she knew the meeting could not be avoided forever. The rooms prepared for the children were bright and comfortable, each with a view of the extensive gardens below. Eleanor's own room, situated nearby for convenience, was simple but pleasant, with a small writing desk near the window and a comfortable-looking bed. It was, she thought, more comfortable than she had expected, given the Duke's reputation for strictness. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor helped the children settle into their new surroundings, unpacking their belongings and reassuring Cassandra, who had grown quiet and clingy, now that the initial excitement of the journey had worn off. "I don't like it here," Cassandra admitted quietly, sitting on the edge of her new bed. "It's too big and too quiet." "It will feel less strange in a few days," Eleanor promised, sitting beside her, and wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders. New places always feel too big and too quiet at first. But soon, you will know every corner of it, and it will feel just as familiar as home. Cassandra leaned into her slightly, comforted by the closeness, and Eleanor felt a familiar warmth in her chest, the quiet reward of her work, even in unfamiliar and uncertain circumstances. That evening, as the sun began to set, and the halls of the manor grew dim with the soft glow of lit candles, Mrs. Whitmore returned to inform Eleanor that the Duke was ready to receive them in his study before supper. Eleanor's stomach tightened with unease as she smoothed the front of her simple gray dress and gathered the two children, leading them carefully through the winding halls toward the Duke's private study. Cassandra held tightly to her hand, and even Edmund walked closer to her side than usual, both children sensing, perhaps, the importance of the moment ahead. The study door was tall and dark, carved with intricate patterns that spoke of old wealth and older traditions. Mrs. Whitmore knocked once, then opened the door, gesturing for them to enter. The Duke stood near the tall windows of his study, much as he had stood near the windows of the ballroom weeks before, his hands clasped loosely behind his back as he looked out over the darkening gardens. He turned as they entered, his expression composed and unreadable, though Eleanor thought she caught, for just a brief moment, a flicker of surprise in his eyes as they settled on her. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice as calm and even as she remembered. "I see you have arrived safely." "Yes, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "The children are settling in well, thanks to your household's kindness." He studied her for a moment longer than necessary, before turning his attention to the two children standing slightly behind her. "Master Edmund, Miss Cassandra, I trust your rooms are comfortable." "Yes, Your Grace," Edmund answered politely, though his voice was quieter than usual. Cassandra, emboldened perhaps by her natural curiosity, tilted her head slightly. "Your house is very big," she said simply. "Do you get lost in it?" For a brief moment, something shifted in the Duke's expression, the faintest trace of amusement, quickly hidden away. "On occasion," he admitted, his tone slightly less formal than before. "Though I have lived here long enough that I rarely do so anymore." Cassandra seemed satisfied with this answer, nodding solemnly, as though filing the information away for future use. The Duke's gaze shifted back to Eleanor, lingering there for a moment. "I trust you understand the arrangement clearly, Miss Whitfield. The children's education will continue as before, under your guidance, with the additional resources of this household at your disposal. I expect discipline to be maintained, and I expect to be informed of any matters requiring my attention." "Of course, Your Grace," Eleanor replied evenly. He studied her for a moment longer, something calculating behind his sharp eyes, as though he were measuring her against some private standard only he understood. "I trust our previous conversation will not interfere with your duties here." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm slightly at the reminder, though she kept her expression composed. "No, Your Grace, I understand my place here, and I intend to fulfill my duties to the best of my ability." Something in his gaze seemed to relax, just slightly, though his expression remained largely unreadable. "Good, see that you do." With that, the brief meeting came to an end, and Mrs. Whitmore ushered them out to prepare for supper, leaving Eleanor with the distinct impression that the coming weeks and months under the Duke's roof would be far more complicated than she had initially anticipated. That night, lying in the unfamiliar comfort of her new room, Eleanor stared up at the shadowed ceiling, her mind turning over the events of the day. The Duke's cold formality in his study had been exactly what she expected, exactly what his reputation had promised. And yet, beneath that careful composure, she thought she had glimpsed something else entirely, a brief flicker of curiosity, quickly hidden away, much like the ghost of a smile she had seen at the ball weeks before. She told herself it did not matter. She was here for the children, for their education and comfort, nothing more. Whatever strange, unspoken tension existed between herself and the Duke of Ashworth was simply a passing curiosity, nothing worth dwelling on. But as sleep finally claimed her, the memory of his voice lingered at the edges of her mind, quiet and persistent, refusing to be entirely forgotten. Life at Ashworth Manor settled into a routine, faster than Eleanor had expected. Mornings began early, with lessons for Cassandra and Edmund in the sunlit schoolroom on the manor's second floor, followed by walks through the gardens when weather allowed. and quiet afternoons of reading and needlework. The household staff, though initially reserved around the newcomers, gradually warmed to the children's presence, and even Mrs. Whitmore, usually so composed, could be seen smiling whenever Cassandra came skipping through the halls with some new discovery to share. The Duke, however, remained largely absent from their daily life. He kept to his study, his correspondence, and the endless demands of managing a large estate, appearing only briefly at supper, and even then, saying little beyond what courtesy required. Eleanor told herself this suited her perfectly well. The less she saw of him, the less she had to think about that strange, unsettling warning he had given her weeks before, or the flicker of something unreadable she thought she had glimpsed in his eyes since. And yet, despite her best efforts, their paths continued to cross in small, unavoidable ways. It began with the matter of Edmund's lessons. The boy, though intelligent, had grown increasingly withdrawn since their arrival at the manor, spending less time on his studies and more time staring quietly out of windows, lost in thoughts he rarely shared. Eleanor noticed it, of course. It was her business to notice such things, but her gentle attempts to draw him out had met with only limited success. It was a particularly gray Tuesday afternoon when matters came to a small, unexpected head. Eleanor had set the children a simple exercise in arithmetic, expecting perhaps 20 minutes of quiet, focused work. Instead, she found Edmund staring blankly at his slate, his chalk untouched, his expression distant and troubled. "Edmund," she said gently, moving to sit beside him, "is something wrong?" He did not answer immediately, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the small wooden desk. "I don't want to do sums," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "I don't see the point of it." Eleanor studied him carefully, sensing there was more beneath the surface of his simple refusal. "Is there something troubling you, Edmund? You may tell me, if you wish." For a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the window and the gray, overcast sky beyond it. Then, quietly, almost too quiet to hear, he said, "I miss Papa." Eleanor's chest tightened with quiet sympathy. Edmund and Cassandra's father had passed away nearly 2 years prior, and though Cassandra, being younger, had adjusted with the resilience children often showed, Edmund had carried his grief more privately, more heavily. "That is understandable," Eleanor said softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It is all right to miss him, Edmund. Grief does not simply disappear because time has passed." "Everyone expects me to be all right now," Edmund said, his voice cracking slightly with an emotion he clearly struggled to contain. "Grandmother says I must be strong for Cassandra, but I don't feel strong. I just feel—" He trailed off, unable to find the right word. "Lost?" Eleanor offered gently. Edmund nodded, his eyes glistening slightly, with unshed tears. He was clearly trying hard not to let fall. Eleanor considered her next words carefully. "It is all right to feel lost sometimes, Edmund. Being strong does not mean pretending you feel nothing. It simply means continuing forward, even when things are difficult. And you do not have to do that alone. I am here, and your sister needs you, even if she does not always show it in ways you expect." Edmund wiped quickly at his eyes, embarrassed by the tears that had escaped despite his efforts. "You won't tell grandmother, will you? Or His Grace?" "Of course not," Eleanor reassured him. "This is between us, unless you wish to share it with someone else." It was in this quiet, private moment of comfort that the study door, left slightly ajar, creaked further open, and Eleanor turned to find the Duke standing in the doorway, clearly having witnessed at least part of the exchange. She had not heard him approach, too absorbed in comforting Edmund to notice the soft sound of his footsteps in the hall. For a moment, none of them spoke, the room falling into an awkward, uncertain silence. "Forgive the interruption," the Duke said finally, his voice quieter than his usual formal tone. "I did not mean to intrude." Edmund straightened quickly, wiping the last traces of tears from his face, and sitting up with forced composure, clearly embarrassed at having been seen in such a vulnerable state by the Duke himself. Eleanor rose to her feet, smoothing the front of her dress, uncertain how much of the conversation he had overheard, and uncertain, too, how he might respond to it. "Master Edmund was simply having a difficult morning, Your Grace," she said carefully, choosing her words with care. "We were discussing his lessons." The Duke's sharp eyes moved from Eleanor to Edmund, studying the boy for a long moment, with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. Then, to her surprise, his tone softened slightly. "Edmund," he said, his voice steady, but noticeably gentler than his usual formal address. "Would you walk with me for a moment?" Edmund glanced uncertainly at Eleanor, who gave him a small, encouraging nod before rising slowly from his seat and following the Duke out of the schoolroom and into the hall beyond. Eleanor remained behind with Cassandra, who had been quietly working on her own lesson throughout the exchange, seemingly unaware of the deeper undercurrents at play. But Eleanor's mind lingered on the unexpected softness in the Duke's voice, the surprising gentleness with which he had addressed the grieving boy. It was not the reaction she had expected from a man known throughout society for his cold, exacting nature. She did not learn what passed between the Duke and Edmund during their walk, as neither of them spoke of it afterward. But she noticed, in the days that followed, a subtle shift in Edmund's demeanor. Not a sudden transformation, but small, steady signs of improvement. He applied himself more diligently to his lessons, spoke more freely at supper, and even smiled, on occasion, in a way Eleanor had not seen since their arrival at the manor. Whatever words the Duke had offered him that day, they had clearly mattered. It was nearly a week later that Eleanor found herself once again in the Duke's unexpected company, this time under far less emotional circumstances. She had taken the children to the manor's expansive library one rainy afternoon, hoping to occupy them with quiet reading while the weather kept them indoors. Cassandra, easily distracted as ever, soon grew restless among the shelves of serious, adult volumes and wandered toward a nearby window seat, where she began arranging a small assortment of pressed flowers she had collected earlier in the week. Edmund, meanwhile, had found a book on naval history that held his attention completely, curling into a large armchair with quiet focus. Eleanor took the opportunity to browse the shelves herself, searching for something suitable to read to the children later that evening. It was in the midst of this quiet search that she rounded a tall shelf and nearly collided, for the second time since their acquaintance began, with the Duke himself. "Your Grace," she said, startled, stepping back quickly. "Forgive me. I did not realize you were here." "No need for apologies," he said, though there was a faint trace of something almost like amusement in his voice. "It seems we have a habit of nearly colliding with one another, Miss Whitfield." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm slightly at the observation, though she kept her tone composed. "It seems we do, Your Grace." He studied the books she held in her arms for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the titles with obvious curiosity. "Fairy tales?" he asked, noting one particular volume near the top of her small stack. "For Cassandra," Eleanor explained. "She enjoys stories with clear, happy endings, particularly on gray days, such as this one." "And what of Edmund?" the Duke asked, glancing toward the boy, still absorbed in his naval history book across the room. "He prefers stories of adventure and discovery," Eleanor answered, "though I suspect there is more depth to his interests than he lets on." The Duke nodded slowly, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes. "He is a sensitive boy," he said quietly, almost to himself, more than his sister perhaps. "You noticed that as well," Eleanor said, somewhat surprised by his perceptiveness. "I notice a great many things, Miss Whitfield," the Duke replied, his gaze shifting back to her, with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly in her throat. "More perhaps than people expect of me." There was something in the way he said it, not quite a challenge, but not entirely simple conversation either, that left Eleanor uncertain how to respond. She found herself studying him more closely than she had allowed herself to before, noticing small details she had previously overlooked, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the slight stiffness in his shoulders that suggested a man carrying more weight than his composed exterior revealed. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she said finally, curiosity overcoming her usual caution. He tilted his head slightly, considering. "You may ask. I make no promises of an answer." "What did you say to Edmund, that day in the schoolroom?" "Whatever it was, it seems to have helped him considerably." For a long moment, the Duke said nothing, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window, where rain continued its steady patter against the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost reflective. "I told him that grief does not follow a schedule others set for it," he said slowly. "That there is no shame in feeling lost, provided one does not remain lost forever. I told him that I understood, better than most, how heavy that particular burden can be. Something in his tone suggested a depth of personal experience Eleanor had not expected, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time, what losses lay hidden behind the Duke's carefully maintained composure. "You speak from experience, Your Grace," she said gently, though it was more observation than question. His eyes met hers again, something guarded shifting behind them, as though he had said more than he intended. "Everyone carries losses, Miss Whitfield. Some simply learn to hide them better than others." Before Eleanor could respond, Cassandra's voice rang out cheerfully from across the library. "Miss Eleanor, look what I made!" The moment was broken, the unexpected intimacy of their conversation dissolving as quickly as it had formed. The Duke straightened slightly, his familiar composed mask settling back into place, though Eleanor thought she caught, just briefly, a flicker of something like reluctance in his expression, as though he too had been unwilling to let the conversation end so abruptly. "I will leave you to your reading, Miss Whitfield," he said formally, stepping back. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, watching as he made his way toward the library's tall doors and disappeared into the hall beyond. She stood there a moment longer, the books still held loosely in her arms, turning over their brief but unexpectedly personal exchange in her mind. There was more to the Duke of Ashworth, she was beginning to realize, than the cold, controlled reputation that preceded him. Beneath that carefully maintained composure lay something far more complicated: old grief, quiet vulnerability, and a depth of understanding that had clearly touched a grieving young boy in ways Eleanor had not anticipated. She told herself, once again, that it did not matter to her personally. Her concern was for the children's well-being, nothing more. But as she made her way back toward Cassandra's excited display of pressed flowers, she could not quite shake the growing suspicion that the Duke of Ashworth was becoming considerably more difficult to dismiss than she had first assumed. Autumn had begun to settle over Ashworth Manor, painting the gardens in shades of amber and gold, and with it came a quiet shift in the rhythm of the household. The days grew shorter, the evenings cooler, and the family had taken to gathering more often in the smaller, warmer sitting room near the east wing, rather than the grand but drafty formal rooms elsewhere in the house. It was in this smaller, more intimate space that Eleanor began to notice changes she had not expected, not just in Edmund, whose spirits continued to improve steadily, but in the Duke himself. He had begun joining them for supper more regularly, and though his conversation remained measured and often brief, there were moments now when Eleanor caught him watching the children with an expression of quiet, unguarded warmth, an expression entirely at odds with the cold, controlled reputation that preceded him throughout society. She told herself it was simply the natural affection of a guardian toward children in his care, nothing more. And yet, she found herself watching for those small moments more closely than she probably should have. It was on one such evening, following a particularly cheerful supper during which Cassandra had insisted on recounting, in exhaustive detail, the entire plot of a fairy tale Eleanor had read to her the previous night, that Eleanor found herself alone with the Duke for the first time in several weeks, the children having been led off to bed by Mrs. Whitmore. "Your charges are in high spirits this evening," the Duke observed, a faint trace of amusement in his voice, as he set down his cup of tea. "Cassandra has decided that fairy tales are the only stories worth telling," Eleanor replied, allowing herself a small smile. "I fear we shall be hearing about brave princesses and clever foxes for weeks to come. There are worse things a child could be passionate about," the Duke said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone, a softness Eleanor was still not entirely used to hearing from him. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly in the hearth nearby, before Eleanor, emboldened perhaps by the warmth of the evening, found herself asking a question she had been curious about for some time. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" He glanced at her, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "You may ask, though as before, I make no promises." "The staff speak of you rarely, and always carefully," Eleanor said slowly, choosing her words with caution. "As though your history here is something not to be discussed openly. I do not mean to pry, but I find myself curious about the man who has shown such quiet kindness to a grieving young boy, and yet carries a reputation so entirely different from what I have witnessed." For a long moment, the Duke said nothing, his gaze drifting toward the fire, the dancing light casting shifting shadows across his sharp features. Eleanor wondered, briefly, if she had overstepped, if she had pressed too closely against some private wound he preferred to keep hidden. But then, quietly, he began to speak. "My father was a hard man," he said, his voice low and measured, as though each word were being carefully chosen from a place rarely visited. Not cruel, precisely, but exacting, in ways that left little room for weakness, or for feeling. He believed control was the only thing standing between order and chaos, and he raised me according to that belief. Eleanor remained silent, sensing that any interruption might close the door he had only just begun to open. My mother, he continued, was different, warmer. She was the one who read to me as a child, who allowed me moments of softness my father would have dismissed as unnecessary indulgence. But she died when I was 12 years old, quite suddenly, and after that, there was no one left to soften my father's expectations. "I am sorry," Eleanor said quietly, and she meant it. The Duke gave a small, humorless smile. "It was a long time ago. But I tell you this so you understand. I did not become who I am by accident, Miss Whitfield. Every part of my composure, my control, was built deliberately, over many years, because the alternative, in my father's eyes, was unacceptable weakness. And weakness, I learned quickly, was not something the world forgave easily, particularly not in a man destined to inherit what I would eventually inherit." Eleanor considered his words carefully. "But surely, Your Grace, control and feeling are not always opposites. A man may possess both." Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or something closer to reluctant agreement. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "though it has not always felt that way, in my experience. And yet," Eleanor continued gently, "you showed Edmund genuine understanding, genuine warmth, when he needed it most. That does not strike me as the action of a man who has entirely abandoned feeling for the sake of control." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his sharp gaze, before he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Edmund's grief reminded me of my own. At that age, it was difficult to see a child carrying such weight, and not offer what small comfort I could." "That does you credit, Your Grace," Eleanor said softly, "more than your reputation suggests." He looked at her then, something in his expression shifting slightly, softening in a way Eleanor had not seen before. "You are rather direct, Miss Whitfield, in ways most people in my household are not." "I apologize if I have overstepped," Eleanor said, though she did not entirely mean it. "You have not," the Duke replied, somewhat to her surprise. "It is refreshing, actually. Most people around me speak carefully, weighing every word for how it might be received. You simply say what you believe to be true. Is that not usually the wiser course, Your Grace?" "Not always," he said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips for just a moment before fading again. "But in your case, I find I do not mind it." The conversation lingered in Eleanor's mind long after she had retired to her room that evening. She lay awake, staring up at the shadowed ceiling, turning over everything the Duke had shared with her. His difficult father, his mother's early death, the careful construction of the controlled, composed man he had become. It painted a picture entirely different from the cold, unfeeling reputation that preceded him throughout society, and Eleanor found herself, uncomfortably, beginning to feel something more than simple curiosity toward him. She told herself it was merely sympathy, understanding born of shared human experience. But some quiet, honest part of her recognized it as something more complicated than that. The days that followed brought further small moments that continued to chip away at the careful wall Eleanor had built around her initial impressions of the Duke. She witnessed him one afternoon, unaware of her presence nearby, gently correcting a young stable boy's technique with quiet patience rather than the sharp reprimand she might have expected. She noticed the careful, unspoken kindness he showed to Mrs. Whitmore and other longtime staff, remembering small details of their lives, a daughter's upcoming wedding, a son recovering from illness, that suggested a man far more attentive to those around him than his reputation allowed. And yet, alongside these glimpses of unexpected warmth, Eleanor also began to notice the moments when the Duke's careful control slipped in less comfortable ways, a flash of old grief crossing his features when a particular topic arose at supper, a tightness in his shoulders during certain correspondence that clearly troubled him, though he never spoke of its contents. It was on one such occasion, nearly 2 weeks after their conversation by the fire, that Eleanor witnessed a moment of vulnerability she suspected the Duke had not intended anyone to see. She had been searching for Edmund, who had wandered off during a break in his lessons, and her search led her toward the manor's private chapel, a small, quiet building set apart from the main house, rarely used except for special occasions. She had not expected to find the Duke there, standing alone, before a modest stone memorial set into the chapel's far wall, his shoulders uncharacteristically bowed, his composed mask entirely absent from his features. Eleanor paused in the doorway, uncertain whether to announce her presence or quietly withdraw. But before she could decide, he seemed to sense her there, turning slightly, his expression caught between grief and something almost like embarrassment at having been seen in such an unguarded state. "Forgive me," Eleanor said quickly, stepping back. "I did not mean to intrude, Your Grace. I was searching for Edmund." "He is not here," the Duke said, his voice rougher than his usual composed tone. "You may go, if you wish." Eleanor hesitated, something in his tired, grief-worn expression stirring a quiet compassion within her she could not simply ignore. "Is everything all right, Your Grace?" For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze drifting back toward the modest memorial before them. Eleanor could see now that it bore a name and dates, a woman's name, and a date of passing nearly 15 years prior. "My mother's memorial," he said quietly, answering her unspoken question. "Today marks the anniversary of her passing." "I am so sorry, Your Grace," Eleanor said gently, moving a few steps closer, though still keeping a respectful distance. He gave a small, humorless laugh. 15 years, and still it feels as though no time has passed at all, on this particular day. "Grief does not follow a schedule, Your Grace," Eleanor said softly, echoing the very words he had once offered to Edmund. "There is no shame in still feeling this, after so many years." He turned to look at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression, entirely unlike the composed, controlled man Eleanor had come to know over the past several weeks. "You remember what I told the boy?" "It was good advice," Eleanor said simply. "Perhaps you should heed it yourself, on occasion." For a long moment, their eyes remained locked, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet stillness of the small chapel. Eleanor felt her heart beating a little too quickly, a little too loudly, in the charged silence that followed. Then, quietly, the Duke spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You see through me rather easily, Miss Whitfield, in ways I confess I am not entirely comfortable with." "I do not mean to see through you, Your Grace," Eleanor said gently, "only to offer whatever small comfort I can, as I would to anyone in genuine grief." Something shifted in his expression at her words. Not quite a smile, but something softer, more open than she had seen from him before. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than their brevity suggested. Eleanor nodded, offering a small, understanding smile of her own, before quietly excusing herself, leaving him alone once more, with his private grief and the quiet memorial of the mother he had lost so many years before. But as she made her way back through the manor's halls in search of Edmund, her mind remained firmly fixed on the moment she had just witnessed, the raw, unguarded vulnerability behind the Duke's carefully maintained composure, and the strange, unsettling warmth that had bloomed unexpectedly in her own chest at having been trusted, even briefly, with a glimpse of the man behind the title. She told herself, once again, that it did not matter, that her feelings, whatever they were beginning to become, were simply misplaced sympathy, nothing more. But deep down, in a place she was only just beginning to acknowledge, Eleanor suspected that the careful walls she had built around her own heart were beginning to crack, just as surely as the Duke's own composed defenses had begun to crumble in her presence. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it sharp winds and frost that coated the gardens of Ashworth Manor in delicate white patterns each morning. The household adjusted accordingly. Fires kept burning longer in every room, and the children's outdoor walks grew shorter and less frequent. Eleanor found herself settling into a rhythm she had not expected to feel so comfortable within. The quiet mornings of lessons, the companionable evenings by the fire, and the increasingly frequent moments of unguarded conversation with the Duke, whose careful composure seemed, little by little, to soften whenever she was near. She told herself, still, that nothing had truly changed between them. He was her employer, the guardian of the children in her care, and she was simply a governess fulfilling her duties. But even as she repeated this to herself, Some quiet, honest part of her recognized how thin that reasoning had become. It was a matter concerning Edmund that finally forced the delicate balance between them into open conflict. The trouble began with a visit from the Duke's cousin, a sharp-tongued, ambitious man named Mr. Reginald Ashworth, who arrived at the manor unannounced one gray afternoon, claiming urgent family business that required the Duke's immediate attention. Eleanor took an instinctive dislike to him from their very first meeting. Something in the calculating way his eyes moved over the household, assessing value and opportunity in equal measure, unsettled her deeply. Reginald's true purpose became clear over the following days. As a distant relation with modest means of his own, he had long harbored ambitions regarding the Ashworth fortune, and Edmund, being young and impressionable, appeared to him a convenient target for cultivating influence that might later prove useful. He began seeking out the boy's company under the guise of friendly interest, filling his head with exaggerated tales of adventure and grand promises of future opportunities, all while subtly encouraging behavior entirely unsuited to a boy of his age and temperament. Reckless dares, disrespect toward the household staff, and a growing disregard for his lessons. Eleanor noticed the change in Edmund almost immediately, his newfound defiance and careless attitude a troubling contrast to the thoughtful, if grieving boy she had come to know over the past months. "You cannot make me do sums today," Edmund declared one morning, crossing his arms with a stubbornness Eleanor had not seen from him before. "Cousin Reginald says, a future gentleman need not concern himself with such trivial matters." Eleanor kept her expression calm, though concern was already building steadily within her. "Your cousin's opinions on your education are not relevant here, Edmund. Your lessons continue as they always have." "You are only a governess," Edmund shot back, his voice carrying an unfamiliar edge of arrogance. "You cannot truly command me." The words stung more than Eleanor cared to admit, though she recognized immediately that they were not truly Edmund's own. They carried the unmistakable influence of his cousin's careless, self-serving guidance. Still, she could not allow such disrespect to continue unaddressed, both for the sake of Edmund's own character and the safety of his future. She raised the matter with the Duke that same evening, choosing her words carefully as they spoke privately in his study, after the children had retired for the night. "Your Grace, I am concerned about the influence your cousin is having on Edmund," she said directly, having learned by now that careful indirectness rarely served her well with him. His encouragement toward reckless behavior, his dismissive attitude toward proper discipline, I fear it is undoing much of the progress Edmund has made since our arrival. The Duke's expression grew troubled, though he hesitated before responding. "Reginald has always been somewhat careless in his manner," he admitted slowly. "But he is family, Miss Whitfield, and family obligations are not so easily dismissed, particularly given certain financial considerations currently at play." Eleanor's concern deepened at his careful phrasing. "What financial considerations, Your Grace?" The Duke's jaw tightened slightly, clearly reluctant to discuss the matter further, though he answered nonetheless. "Reginald has approached me regarding a business venture requiring significant investment. I am considering the proposal, partly out of family obligation, and partly because it may indeed prove profitable. And in the meantime, he continues to negatively influence Edmund, seemingly without consequence," Eleanor said, unable to entirely mask the frustration in her voice. "I will speak with him," the Duke said, though something in his tone suggested reluctance rather than firm resolve. Eleanor recognized, with growing unease, that the Duke's judgment in this particular matter was clouded by complicated family loyalty and financial temptation, both of which stood directly in the way of Edmund's well-being. It was not a position she felt comfortable simply accepting, regardless of the risk to her own standing within the household. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I understand the complexities of family obligation, but Edmund's character, his future, is far more valuable than any business arrangement, however profitable it may prove. I must ask that you consider limiting your cousin's access to the children until this influence can be properly addressed." The Duke's expression grew sharper at her words, something like genuine displeasure crossing his features for the first time since Eleanor had witnessed his more vulnerable side. "You forget yourself, Miss Whitfield. This is a family matter, and my judgment regarding it is not yours to question." "With respect, Your Grace," Eleanor pressed on, despite the clear warning in his tone. "Edmund's well-being is very much within my responsibility. and I cannot, in good conscience, remain silent while his character is being actively undermined. I have already said I will speak with Reginald, the Duke said, his voice growing colder, more formal, retreating rapidly back into the controlled composure Eleanor had not seen from him in weeks. That will have to suffice, for now. And if it does not? Eleanor asked, unable to fully hold back the frustration building within her. If your cousin continues regardless, simply because he senses no true consequence to his actions, then I will address it further, as I see fit, the Duke said sharply, without requiring your continued input on the matter. The words landed with unexpected sharpness, and Eleanor felt her own temper rising in response, despite her usual careful composure. Forgive me, Your Grace, but I cannot simply stand aside while a child's future is placed at risk for the sake of family courtesy and financial gain. That is precisely what I am asking you to do, the Duke said, his voice now unmistakably cold. The warmth Eleanor had grown accustomed to entirely vanished. Do not challenge me further on this matter, Miss Whitfield. The echo of his earlier warning, spoken that very first night at the ball, struck Eleanor with unexpected force. She felt herself tense, old instincts urging her to simply lower her eyes and retreat, as she once might have done. But the memory of Edmund's troubled, defiant expression that morning, the unmistakable damage already being done to a grieving, impressionable boy, hardened her resolve rather than weakening it. I understand you do not wish to be challenged, Your Grace, she said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air between them. But my duty is to the children in my care, not to family courtesies I do not fully understand. If protecting Edmund's well-being means challenging you, then I am afraid I must accept that risk. For a long, tense moment, the Duke said nothing, his sharp eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that made her heart pound uncomfortably in her chest. She had never seen him quite this angry before, his usual careful composure replaced by something far more volatile, though still carefully restrained. You test the limits of your position, Miss Whitfield, he said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. Perhaps, Eleanor replied, refusing to back down despite the fear coiling tightly in her stomach. But I would rather test those limits than fail in my duty to a child who has already lost so much. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long, neither of them willing to look away first. Eleanor braced herself for the possibility of immediate dismissal, her position, her livelihood, hanging uncertainly in the balance of his next words. But then, unexpectedly, something in the Duke's rigid posture seemed to ease, just slightly, the anger in his expression giving way to something more complicated, reluctant respect perhaps, mixed uneasily with lingering irritation. You are either the bravest woman I have ever employed, he said slowly, or the most reckless. Perhaps both, Your Grace, Eleanor replied quietly, echoing words she had once spoken to him at their very first meeting. Something flickered behind his eyes at the familiar phrase, recognition, and something almost like the ghost of a smile, quickly suppressed beneath his lingering displeasure. I will address the matter with Reginald more firmly, he said finally, his voice quieter now, though still carrying an edge of reluctant admission. His influence on Edmund ends, effective immediately. I will find a means of resolving the business matter, without requiring his continued presence in this household. Relief flooded through Eleanor, though she kept her expression carefully composed. Thank you, Your Grace. Do not mistake this for weakness on my part, Miss Whitfield, the Duke added, his tone regaining some of its familiar sharpness. I have simply concluded, independently, that Edmund's well-being takes precedence. Of course, Your Grace, Eleanor said, though she suspected, privately, that her own insistence had played no small part in his decision. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable, but decidedly less hostile behind his sharp gaze. You do not back down easily, he observed quietly. Not when it matters, Your Grace, Eleanor replied simply. The Duke gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, before turning back toward his desk, effectively signaling the end of their difficult conversation. Eleanor took her leave quietly, her heart still pounding from the tension of their exchange, though beneath the lingering nervousness, she felt something else entirely, a quiet, unexpected pride in having stood her ground, despite the very real risk to her position within the household. True to his word, the Duke addressed the matter with his cousin firmly within the following days. Reginald departed the manor shortly after, his ambitions regarding both Edmund's influence and the proposed business venture, quietly but decisively dismissed. Edmund's troubling behavior faded gradually in the weeks that followed, his earlier thoughtfulness and improving spirits slowly returning. But the confrontation between Eleanor and the Duke left its own lasting mark, shifting something subtle but undeniable in the dynamic between them. Where before there had been careful, guarded conversation and unexpected moments of shared vulnerability, there now existed something new, a quiet, mutual respect born from genuine conflict, and the recognition, on both sides, that Eleanor was not simply a governess who would bow easily to authority, even one as formidable as the Duke of Ashworth. For his part, the Duke found himself watching her with renewed and reluctant interest, unable to entirely dismiss the memory of her steady, unflinching resolve in the face of his displeasure. It was not simple defiance she had shown him, he realized slowly, but genuine conviction, a quality he found himself respecting far more than he had expected, and admiring, perhaps, more than he was entirely comfortable admitting, even to himself. And Eleanor, though she told herself repeatedly that their conflict had been simply a matter of duty and principle, found she could not quite shake the memory of the Duke's grudging respect, nor the quiet, unsettling warmth that had bloomed unexpectedly in her chest, at the sight of his carefully guarded anger, finally giving way to something softer. Whatever careful walls had existed between them before, Eleanor suspected, uneasily, that they had both just changed irrevocably. The weeks following Reginald's departure brought a quiet, settled peace to Ashworth Manor that Eleanor had not experienced since her arrival. Edmund's spirits continued to improve steadily, his lessons resumed their thoughtful diligence, and even Cassandra, sensing the lighter mood throughout the household, seemed to skip through the halls with even greater enthusiasm than usual. Winter deepened around them, the gardens now blanketed in soft, unbroken snow, and the fires within the manor burned late into each evening, casting warm, golden light across rooms that had once felt cold and unfamiliar. But amid this quiet peace, Eleanor noticed a curious change in the Duke himself, one that puzzled her far more than his earlier displeasure ever had. Where before their confrontation he had begun joining the family for supper with increasing regularity, sharing quiet moments of unexpected warmth and vulnerability, he now seemed to withdraw, deliberately and carefully, back into the distant formality Eleanor remembered from their very first meetings. He took his meals more often alone in his study, citing pressing estate matters that required his undivided attention. When their paths did cross in the halls or library, his greetings grew brief and carefully polite, lacking the easy warmth that had begun to develop between them in recent months. At first, Eleanor assumed this shift was simply the lingering aftermath of their heated disagreement over Reginald, a natural coolness following conflict, even one that had ultimately resolved favorably. But as the weeks passed and the distance between them showed no signs of easing, she began to suspect something else entirely was at play. She found her answer, quite by accident, one quiet evening in mid-December. She had gone to the library in search of a particular volume of poetry Cassandra had requested, only to find the room already occupied. The Duke sat near the fire, a glass of brandy, untouched on the small table beside him, his gaze fixed not on any book or correspondence, but on the dancing flames themselves, his expression distant and troubled in a way Eleanor had not seen since their conversation in the chapel weeks before. She hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to withdraw quietly or announce her presence, but before she could decide, he noticed her there, straightening slightly, his composed mask sliding back into place with visible effort. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice carefully even, "I did not expect anyone else here this evening." "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, though something in his troubled expression made her linger rather than retreat, as duty might have suggested. "I was searching for a book for Cassandra. I can return another time, if you prefer solitude." He studied her for a long moment, something conflicted behind his sharp eyes, before gesturing, somewhat reluctantly, toward the shelves. "There is no need. Please, find what you require." Eleanor moved slowly toward the shelves, though her attention remained partly on the Duke, whose troubled silence seemed to fill the room with an almost tangible weight. She found the volume of poetry easily enough, but found herself hesitating before leaving, some quiet instinct urging her not to simply walk away. "Your Grace," she said finally, turning back toward him, "forgive my directness, but you have seemed distant these past weeks. Distracted, in ways that concern me. His jaw tightened slightly at her observation. Estate matters require considerable attention this time of year, Miss Whitfield. Nothing more. With respect, Your Grace, I do not believe that is the whole truth, Eleanor said carefully, recognizing the risk in pressing further, but unable to simply let the matter rest. The Duke's eyes met hers then, something sharp and almost pained flickering behind his controlled expression. You are rather persistent, Miss Whitfield, in matters that do not concern you. Perhaps not, Eleanor admitted, but I find myself concerned nonetheless. For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze drifting back toward the fire, some internal struggle clearly playing out behind his carefully guarded expression. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, more measured, though the words themselves carried an unexpected weight. I have spent my entire life, Miss Whitfield, learning to control every aspect of my circumstances, he said slowly. My estate, my reputation, my household, even my own emotions, when necessary. It is a discipline I inherited from my father, and one I have maintained rigorously, regardless of personal cost. I am aware, Your Grace, Eleanor said gently, sensing he was building toward something important. And yet, he continued, his voice growing quieter still, I find myself, of late, confronting something I cannot seem to control, no matter how diligently I apply myself to the task. Eleanor's heart began to beat a little faster, though she kept her expression carefully composed. What is it that troubles you so, Your Grace? He looked at her then, something raw and unguarded in his gaze, unlike anything she had seen from him before, even in their most private conversations. You, Miss Whitfield, he said quietly, you are the thing I cannot seem to control. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them had yet fully acknowledged. Eleanor felt her breath catch slightly, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected, unguarded admission. Your Grace, please, he interrupted, though not unkindly. Allow me to finish, now that I have begun. Eleanor nodded silently, her heart pounding uncomfortably, as she waited for him to continue. I have spent considerable effort, these past weeks, attempting to maintain proper distance between us, he said slowly, his voice carrying an unfamiliar vulnerability. I told myself it was simple prudence, given the difference in our positions, and the impropriety of a man in my circumstances harboring feelings toward a woman in yours. I convinced myself that distance, careful and deliberate, would resolve whatever inappropriate sentiment had begun to develop. Eleanor's chest tightened at his words, a complicated tangle of emotions rising within her that she was not entirely prepared to examine. Your Grace, I do not think. But it has not resolved, he continued, ignoring her attempted interruption, regardless of how diligently I have applied myself to the effort. If anything, the distance has only made the matter more apparent to me, rather than less. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of his admission settling heavily in the quiet library air between them. Eleanor felt her own carefully maintained composure beginning to crack, old warnings about propriety and position warring against the undeniable warmth that had been building steadily within her own chest for weeks now. Your Grace, she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. I confess I do not entirely know how to respond to what you have shared. I do not expect a response, Miss Whitfield, the Duke said, something almost like resignation in his tone. I share this only because I find I can no longer maintain the pretense of indifference, at least not to myself. Whatever comes of this admission, I felt you deserved honesty, given everything else that has passed between us. Eleanor studied him carefully, noting the genuine vulnerability in his expression, so different from the composed, controlled man society believed him to be. Your Grace, I must ask, what precisely do you believe should come of this admission? He was quiet for a long moment, clearly turning the question over carefully in his mind. I do not know, he admitted finally. Propriety would suggest I simply maintain my earlier resolve, distance myself further, and allow this complication to fade with time. It would certainly be the wiser course, given our respective positions. And yet, Eleanor prompted gently, sensing there was more he had not yet said. And yet, he continued slowly, I find myself, for perhaps the first time in my adult life, genuinely uncertain of the wisest course. Every instinct trained into me by years of careful discipline urges caution, distance, control, but some other part of me, one I confess I do not entirely recognize, resists that same counsel rather stubbornly. Eleanor felt her own heart echoing his uncertainty, torn between the practical caution that had guided her own life thus far, and the undeniable warmth that had grown, quietly and steadily, within her own chest over these past months. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I will not pretend I do not understand the complication you describe. I have felt something developing as well these past months, though I have tried, much as you have, to dismiss it as simple sympathy or misplaced admiration." His eyes met hers then, something hopeful flickering briefly behind his guarded expression. "And have you succeeded in dismissing it?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, recognizing the importance of her answer. "No," she admitted quietly, "I have not." The admission hung between them, fragile and significant, neither of them quite certain what should follow such mutual, unguarded honesty. The fire crackled softly nearby, casting flickering shadows across both their faces, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply absorbing the weight of what had just passed between them. "This complicates matters considerably," the Duke said finally, though his tone carried less distress than his words might have suggested. "It does," Eleanor agreed softly. "I do not know what should be done about it," he admitted, something almost like a rueful smile touching his lips briefly. "Nor do I, Your Grace," Eleanor replied honestly. They sat together in comfortable, if uncertain, silence for a long while after that, neither quite ready to address the full implications of what had just been shared between them, but both, perhaps for the first time, unwilling to simply retreat back into the careful distance that had defined their recent weeks together. Eventually, Eleanor rose to take her leave, the volume of poetry still held loosely in her hands, though her thoughts remained far from Cassandra's request for the evening. "Good night, Your Grace," she said softly. "Good night, Miss Whitfield," he replied, his voice carrying a warmth entirely unlike the careful formality of recent weeks. As Eleanor made her way back through the quiet halls of the manor, her mind remained fixed on everything that had just passed between them. The Duke's unexpected vulnerability, his admission of feelings he could not control despite every careful effort, and her own honest acknowledgement of similar sentiments growing within her own heart. She understood, walking slowly through those familiar candlelit corridors, that whatever careful balance had existed between them before that evening had now shifted irrevocably. The path ahead remained uncertain, complicated by matters of position and propriety that neither of them could simply ignore. But for the first time since her arrival at Ashworth Manor, Eleanor found herself looking toward that uncertain future, not with anxiety, but with a quiet, cautious hope she had not expected to feel. The Duke of Ashworth, a man renowned throughout society for his unshakable control, had finally confronted the one thing he could never quite command, his own heart. And Eleanor, despite every instinct urging caution, found she could not entirely regret having been the cause of that particular, unexpected surrender. Christmas approached at Ashworth Manor with a flurry of quiet preparation, the household staff busy decorating the halls with evergreen boughs and ribbons, while Cassandra grew nearly impossible to contain in her excitement over the coming celebrations. Eleanor found herself swept along in the cheerful bustle of preparation, grateful, in a way, for the distraction it provided from the complicated tangle of emotions that had taken root within her since that quiet evening in the library. She had not seen the Duke alone since that night, though their paths crossed often enough at supper and in passing throughout the manor. There was a new carefulness between them now, an unspoken awareness that colored every interaction, however brief. Eleanor caught him watching her sometimes across the supper table, his gaze lingering a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed before he looked away, and she suspected, with a small private thrill she was not entirely proud of, that he caught her doing precisely the same thing in return. Neither of them spoke openly of what had passed between them that evening. It seemed, by unspoken agreement, that both preferred to let the matter settle quietly for a time, allowing the ordinary rhythms of the household to continue undisturbed, while each privately considered what, if anything, should be done about feelings neither could easily dismiss nor easily act upon. But quiet rhythms, Eleanor was learning, rarely lasted long at Ashworth Manor. The disruption arrived in the form of a letter, delivered by messenger on a cold, bright morning, just 1 week before Christmas. Eleanor was in the schoolroom with the children, when Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, her expression unusually grave. "Miss Whitfield," the housekeeper said quietly, "His Grace requests your presence in his study, at your earliest convenience." Eleanor felt a small flutter of unease at the housekeeper's tone, though she kept her expression composed for the children's sake. "Of course, Cassandra, Edmund, please continue your reading until I return." She made her way through the familiar halls with a growing sense of apprehension, uncertain what could have prompted such an urgent summons. When she reached the study, she found the Duke standing near his desk, a letter held tightly in one hand, his expression tight with barely contained tension. "Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully, closing the door behind her, "Mrs. Whitmore said you wished to see me." "Sit down, please," he said, his voice tighter than usual, though not unkind. Eleanor took the offered seat, watching him carefully as he seemed to gather his thoughts before speaking. "This letter," he said finally, holding it up briefly, before setting it down on the desk, "is from Lord Pemberton, a long-time associate of my family, and a man whose opinion carries considerable weight within certain social circles." "I see," Eleanor said, though she did not yet understand the relevance to herself. "He writes to inform me," the Duke continued, his jaw tight, "that rumors have begun circulating regarding an inappropriate closeness between myself and a member of my household staff. Specifically, Miss Whitfield, regarding yourself." Eleanor felt her stomach drop unpleasantly. "Your Grace, I assure you, nothing improper has—" "I know," the Duke interrupted, though not unkindly. "I do not doubt your conduct, Miss Whitfield, nor in truth, my own, whatever private feelings may exist between us. But rumor cares little for truth, and Lord Pemberton warns that should such talk continue unchecked, it could cause considerable damage to my reputation, to Edmund and Cassandra's standing, and most particularly, to yours." Eleanor's mind raced, understanding immediately the gravity of the situation. A governess accused of impropriety with her employer, however unfounded, could find her reputation, her livelihood, and her future prospects entirely ruined, regardless of the truth of the matter. Men in the Duke's position weathered such rumors far more easily than women in hers. "What would you have me do, Your Grace?" she asked quietly, already dreading the possible answer. The Duke's expression grew troubled, something like genuine reluctance behind his controlled composure. "Lord Pemberton suggests, quite strongly, that I consider alternative arrangements for the children's education, a different governess perhaps, or a proper boarding school, to remove any appearance of impropriety." Eleanor felt her chest tighten painfully at his words, though she kept her expression carefully composed, refusing to let him see how deeply the suggestion affected her. "I understand, Your Grace. If that is what must be done to protect the children's standing, and your own reputation, then I will make arrangements to—" "I have not yet decided to follow his suggestion," the Duke interrupted firmly, something almost fierce entering his tone. "I merely inform you of the situation, because I believe you deserve to know the risks currently at play, given everything that has passed between us." Eleanor studied him carefully, surprised by the firmness of his response. "But surely, Your Grace, if your reputation is truly at risk—" "My reputation," the Duke said, his voice hardening slightly, "has weathered considerably worse than idle gossip, Miss Whitfield. I am more concerned for your own standing, and for the well-being of the children, who have grown attached to you in ways that would be genuinely damaging to disrupt without cause." "Then what do you propose, Your Grace?" Eleanor asked, genuine uncertainty coloring her voice now. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, clearly turning the matter over carefully in his mind. "I propose," he said finally, "that we exercise greater caution in our private conversations, at least for the time being, until such rumors have had opportunity to fade naturally. Public interactions, of course, will continue as necessary for the children's sake, but perhaps it would be wise to limit our private exchanges until circumstances allow for greater discretion." Eleanor felt a complicated mixture of relief and disappointment at his words. Relief that he did not intend to dismiss her from her position. Disappointment that the growing warmth between them must once again retreat into careful distance and restraint. "I understand, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I will exercise whatever caution is necessary." "This is not the resolution I would prefer, Miss Whitfield," the Duke said, something almost apologetic in his tone. "But I believe, for now, it is the wisest course, given the circumstances." "I agree, Your Grace," Eleanor said, though the words felt heavier than she wished to admit. Their renewed distance, however necessary, proved considerably harder to maintain than either of them had anticipated. Eleanor found herself missing the quiet warmth of their private conversations far more than she had expected, and she suspected, from the occasional flickers of longing she caught in the Duke's expression across the supper table, that he felt the same growing frustration. Christmas Day itself brought a brief, welcome respite from the tension, the household gathering together for a celebration that felt, for a few precious hours, entirely removed from matters of rumor and propriety. Cassandra's delighted shrieks over her small collection of gifts, Edmund's quiet pride at a new set of books gifted specifically for his growing interest in naval history, and even the Duke's genuine, unguarded laughter at some small joke shared during the festivities, filled the manor with a warmth Eleanor had not expected to witness so openly. It was during a quiet moment following the day's festivities, as the children finally succumbed to exhausted sleep and the household staff retired for the evening, that Eleanor found herself once again alone with the Duke, this time in the manor's smaller sitting room, a fire crackling softly nearby. A pleasant day, the Duke observed quietly, though there was a wistfulness in his tone that suggested deeper thoughts occupying his mind. Very pleasant, Your Grace, Eleanor agreed. Cassandra spoke of nothing else for weeks beforehand, and I do not think she will stop speaking of it for weeks to come, either. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. She has a gift for enthusiasm, that child. They lapsed into comfortable silence for a moment, though Eleanor sensed an unspoken tension building beneath the surface of their pleasant conversation. Miss Whitfield, the Duke said finally, his voice quieter now, more serious. I find I must ask you something, despite our agreement toward greater caution. You may ask, Your Grace, Eleanor replied softly, echoing words she had once spoken to him. Do you regret, he asked slowly, the growing complication between us, given everything it now threatens, your reputation, your position, your future prospects? If you wish, I will understand entirely. Should you prefer, I simply withdraw whatever feeling has developed and allow matters to return to their previous, simpler arrangement. Eleanor considered his question carefully, recognizing the genuine vulnerability behind it. Your Grace, she said finally, I confess, I have asked myself that very question many times these past weeks, and each time, despite every practical concern, I find myself unable to genuinely wish away what has grown between us, however complicated and inconvenient it may prove. Something in the Duke's expression eased at her words, relief and quiet hope mingling behind his careful composure. Then we find ourselves in agreement, Miss Whitfield, however impractical that agreement may prove. It seems we do, Your Grace, Eleanor said softly, allowing herself a small, genuine smile, despite the uncertainty still hanging over their situation. Neither of them spoke of what precisely should be done about their mutual, growing feelings, given the very real risks still threatening from Lord Pemberton's warnings and the rumors already beginning to circulate. But in that quiet, firelit moment, both of them understood, without needing to speak it aloud, that whatever obstacles lay ahead, neither was truly prepared to simply let the other go. The path forward remained uncertain, complicated by matters of position, propriety, and reputation that neither could easily dismiss. But as Eleanor made her way back to her own room later that evening, her heart considerably lighter than it had been in weeks, she found herself hoping, cautiously but genuinely, that whatever difficulties lay ahead, they might yet find some way through them together. The new year brought with it a bitter cold that settled deep into the stones of Ashworth Manor, but far colder than the weather was the tension that had begun creeping through the household in the weeks following Christmas. Despite the Duke and Eleanor's careful efforts to maintain proper distance, the whispers Lord Pemberton had warned of did not fade as they had hoped. If anything, they grew louder, carried from household to household, through the careless tongues of servants and the idle gossip of society gatherings, that neither Eleanor nor the Duke had any control over. The first sign of real trouble arrived in the form of an invitation. A grand winter gathering hosted by Lady Pemberton herself, Lord Pemberton's wife, a woman known throughout society for her sharp eye and sharper tongue. The Duke was expected to attend, as was customary for a man of his standing, and much to Eleanor's surprise, the invitation specifically requested that he bring the children and their governess, ostensibly so that Lady Pemberton might personally assess the household's propriety. "It is a trap," the Duke said grimly, reading the invitation over breakfast one gray January morning. "Lady Pemberton wishes to see for herself whether the rumors hold any truth." "Then perhaps it would be wiser for me to remain here, Your Grace," Eleanor suggested carefully. "Surely the children could attend with only Mrs. Whitmore as their attendant." "That would only fuel further suspicion," the Duke replied, frowning. "It would appear as though we had something to hide, which would be far more damaging than simply attending and demonstrating, through proper conduct, that the rumors are unfounded." Eleanor could not entirely disagree with his reasoning, though the prospect of attending such a gathering, under the watchful, judgmental eye of Lady Pemberton, filled her with considerable unease. The evening of the gathering arrived with a bitter chill in the air, snow falling steadily as the carriage made its way toward Pemberton House, and grand estate nearly as impressive as Ashworth Manor itself. Eleanor sat quietly with Cassandra and Edmund, doing her best to project calm composure despite the nervous flutter in her stomach, while the Duke sat opposite them, his expression carefully guarded, betraying nothing of whatever tension he too must have been feeling. The gathering itself proved every bit as trying as Eleanor had feared. Lady Pemberton greeted them at the entrance with a smile that did not quite reach her sharp, assessing eyes, her gaze lingering just a moment too long on Eleanor as introductions were made. "Miss Whitfield," Lady Pemberton said, her tone perfectly polite on the surface, though something calculating lay beneath it. "How fortunate that His Grace found someone so capable of managing his young charges." "Thank you, my lady," Eleanor replied carefully, keeping her tone even, despite the clear undertone of suspicion in the older woman's words. The evening proceeded with the usual formal conversations and careful social maneuvering that Eleanor had come to expect from such gatherings, though she remained acutely aware of Lady Pemberton's watchful gaze, following her throughout the evening, along with the whispered conversations that seemed to quiet whenever she or the Duke drew near. It was during a lull in the evening's festivities, while Eleanor stood near a quiet corner keeping watch over Cassandra as the young girl admired a nearby display of winter flowers, that Lady Pemberton approached her directly, her expression sharpening now that the pretense of polite conversation had been set aside. "Miss Whitfield," Lady Pemberton said, her voice lower now, more direct, "I wonder if I might speak with you plainly, given that we are, for the moment, alone." "Of course, my lady," Eleanor replied, bracing herself for whatever confrontation was clearly about to follow. "There has been considerable talk," Lady Pemberton said, her sharp eyes studying Eleanor closely, "regarding the nature of your position within the Ashworth household. Talk that suggests a closeness between yourself and the Duke that extends well beyond the boundaries proper to your station." "I assure you, my lady," Eleanor said carefully, "that my conduct within the Ashworth household has remained entirely proper at all times." "Perhaps," Lady Pemberton said, though her tone made clear she remained unconvinced. "But conduct is not always the full measure of impropriety, Miss Whitfield. Feelings, left unchecked, can prove just as damaging as actions, particularly when they threaten the stability and reputation of a household as prominent as the Duke's." Eleanor felt her chest tighten at the older woman's pointed words, recognizing that Lady Pemberton's concerns extended well beyond simple rumor, striking directly at truths Eleanor had not yet openly acknowledged to anyone beyond the Duke himself. "My lady, I do not believe." "I would strongly advise," Lady Pemberton interrupted, her voice hardening slightly, "that you consider your position carefully, Miss Whitfield. Governesses who overstep the boundaries of their station rarely find sympathy within society, regardless of whatever feelings may or may not exist. Your reputation, your future prospects, all of it could be irrevocably damaged should this matter continue unchecked." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, the Duke himself appeared beside them, having clearly overheard at least the tail end of Lady Pemberton's pointed warning. His expression was carefully composed, though Eleanor could see the tension in his jaw, the barely restrained anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "Lady Pemberton," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "I trust you are enjoying the evening's festivities." "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton replied, straightening slightly, though not entirely masking her surprise at his sudden appearance. "I was simply offering Miss Whitfield some friendly advice regarding matters of propriety." "Were you?" the Duke said, his tone growing noticeably cooler. "How thoughtful of you." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, Lady Pemberton clearly recognizing the shift in the Duke's demeanor, though she did not yet retreat from her position. Your Grace, surely you understand my concerns are motivated purely by care for your household's reputation, and for Miss Whitfield's own well-being. My household's reputation, the Duke said evenly, and Miss Whitfield's well-being, are matters I am fully capable of managing myself, Lady Pemberton, without requiring outside intervention. Of course, Your Grace, Lady Pemberton said, though something in her expression suggested she remained entirely unconvinced. I simply hope to spare everyone involved unnecessary difficulty, should the rumors currently circulating prove to hold any truth. The Duke's expression grew sharper, something dangerous flickering behind his controlled composure. And what precisely do these rumors suggest, Lady Pemberton? Lady Pemberton hesitated for just a moment, clearly recognizing she had perhaps pressed further than was entirely wise, but pride, or perhaps genuine conviction, kept her from retreating entirely. That you have developed inappropriate feelings toward your children's governess, Your Grace. Feelings unsuited to the difference in your respective stations. The words hung heavily in the quiet corner of the gathering, and Eleanor felt her heart pounding uncomfortably as she waited, tense and uncertain, for the Duke's response. For a long moment, he said nothing, his sharp eyes fixed on Lady Pemberton with an intensity that made even that formidable woman shift slightly under his gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet, dangerous edge Eleanor had never heard from him before. And if such feelings did exist, Lady Pemberton, he said slowly, what precisely do you believe should be done about them? Lady Pemberton's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected directness of his question, clearly not having anticipated such a bold response. Your Grace, surely you understand the impropriety of— I understand, the Duke interrupted, his voice growing firmer, that Miss Whitfield has shown more genuine care, more genuine courage, and more genuine integrity in her conduct within my household than most of society has shown in judging matters they know nothing about. Eleanor's breath caught sharply at his words, spoken clearly enough that several nearby guests, drawn by the tension in the air, had begun to take notice of the unfolding confrontation. Your Grace, Lady Pemberton said, her voice tightening with genuine alarm now, you cannot possibly mean to suggest— I mean to suggest, the Duke said, his voice carrying clearly now across the increasingly attentive gathering, that I have grown considerably tired of rumor and gossip dictating matters that concern no one beyond myself and those directly involved. Miss Whitfield's conduct has been beyond reproach, and any feelings that may or may not exist between us are, frankly, none of society's concern. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the nearby guests, and Eleanor felt her cheeks burning with a complicated mixture of embarrassment and something else entirely, a fierce, unexpected gratitude at the Duke's public defense of her character, delivered with a boldness she had not anticipated from a man usually so careful of his public composure. Lady Pemberton, clearly recognizing that the confrontation had shifted well beyond her control, straightened stiffly. Your Grace, I meant no offense. I understand your intentions, Lady Pemberton, the Duke said, his tone softening only slightly. But I would ask that you, and society at large, allow me to manage my own household and my own affairs, without requiring further, friendly advice. With that, he turned toward Eleanor, offering his arm with quiet, deliberate formality. Miss Whitfield, I believe the children have grown tired. Perhaps it is time we took our leave. Eleanor took his offered arm, her hand trembling slightly, though whether from the lingering tension of the confrontation or the warmth of his unexpected public defense, she could not entirely say. Together, they made their way through the now quietly murmuring gathering, collecting Cassandra and Edmund before departing Pemberton House, leaving behind a confrontation that would undoubtedly become the subject of considerable gossip throughout society in the days to come. The carriage ride home passed in tense, contemplative silence, the children having fallen asleep against Eleanor's shoulders shortly after departure. It was only once they arrived back at Ashworth Manor, the children safely delivered to Mrs. Whitmore's care for the night, that Eleanor finally found herself alone with the Duke once more, both of them still processing the weight of what had just occurred. Your Grace, Eleanor said quietly, once they stood together in the manor's entrance hall, you did not need to defend me so publicly. It has likely caused you considerable difficulty. I am aware of the difficulty it may cause, the Duke replied, his voice quieter now, Though carrying a firm conviction, Eleanor had not heard from him before. But I found I could no longer stand by while your character was questioned so unjustly, regardless of the consequences to my own reputation. Eleanor studied him carefully, something warm and fierce blooming steadily within her chest at his words. Why, Your Grace? Why risk so much, for my sake? The Duke met her eyes directly, something raw and entirely unguarded in his expression. Because, Miss Whitfield, I find I can no longer pretend indifference toward feelings I have tried, for months now, to control and suppress. Tonight, faced with Lady Pemberton's unjust accusations, I realized I would rather face the consequences of open honesty than continue hiding behind careful denial. The weight of his words settled heavily between them, charged with implications neither of them had yet openly acknowledged beyond the privacy of their own guarded conversations. Eleanor felt her heart pounding fiercely in her chest, uncertain what would follow such a bold, public declaration of feeling. "What happens now, Your Grace?" she asked softly, genuine uncertainty coloring her voice. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, something resolute settling behind his sharp, thoughtful gaze. "Now," he said slowly, "I believe it is time we stopped hiding from what exists between us, Miss Whitfield, regardless of what society may think of the matter." Eleanor felt a fragile, cautious hope kindling steadily within her chest at his words, though the path ahead remained uncertain, complicated by matters of position and propriety that society would not easily set aside. But standing there in the quiet, candle-lit hall of Ashworth Manor, watching the Duke's carefully guarded composure finally give way to open, honest conviction, Eleanor found herself believing, for the first time since her arrival, that perhaps their future together was not so impossible after all. The days following the confrontation at Pemberton House brought exactly the kind of difficulty the Duke had anticipated. Word of his public defense of Eleanor spread quickly through society, carried from drawing room to drawing room, with the particular speed reserved for scandal. Some accounts were generous, painting the Duke as a man of honor, standing up for an unjustly accused woman. Others were far less kind, suggesting scandal where none had been proven, and questioning the judgment of a man so highly regarded, suddenly behaving so far outside the expectations of his station. Eleanor felt the weight of it most keenly in the careful, sideways glances she now received, whenever she accompanied the children into town for errands or brief outings. Shopkeepers who had once greeted her warmly now offered stiff, uncertain courtesy. A former acquaintance from her days before Ashworth Manor crossed the street rather than exchange pleasantries. And though no one said anything openly unkind to her face, the whispered conversations that followed in her wake told her plainly enough what was being said behind it. She said nothing of this to the Duke, not wishing to add further weight to whatever burden he already carried on her behalf. But he noticed regardless, his sharp eyes missing little when it came to matters concerning her. "You have grown quiet these past days, Miss Whitfield," he observed one evening, as they sat together in the small sitting room after the children had retired, a habit that had become their custom once more since Pemberton House. Propriety be somewhat set aside, now that the truth of their feelings had been openly acknowledged between them. "I am simply tired, Your Grace," Eleanor said, though her tone lacked its usual conviction. The Duke studied her carefully, clearly unconvinced. "I have heard, from more than one source, how you have been received in town of late. You need not protect me from the truth of it, Eleanor." The use of her given name, spoken so naturally, sent a small warmth through her chest, despite the heaviness of the conversation. It had become something private between them in recent weeks, a small intimacy neither of them commented upon directly, though both clearly cherished it. "It is nothing I cannot bear, Alexander," she replied, using his given name in return, watching the small, pleased flicker in his eyes at hearing it from her lips. "Society's opinion has never been something I could control, and I have long since learned not to let it dictate my own sense of worth." "Nevertheless," the Duke said, his jaw tightening slightly, "it troubles me greatly that you should suffer such treatment on my account." "You did nothing wrong, Alexander," Eleanor said firmly. "You simply spoke honestly, in defense of my character. If society chooses to punish honesty rather than reward it, that reflects poorly on society, not on either of us." The Duke reached across the small distance between their chairs, taking her hand gently in his own, a gesture that would have seemed unthinkable months before, but now felt entirely natural between them. "You are remarkably generous, Eleanor," given the difficulty you have faced. I have faced worse difficulties than gossip, Alexander. Alexander, Eleanor said quietly, thinking briefly of the losses and hardships that had shaped her own life long before Ashworth Manor had ever entered it. This, I can manage. It was in the midst of this delicate, uncertain period that a new complication arrived, one neither of them had anticipated, and one that would test the depth of their newly acknowledged feelings far more severely than gossip or society's disapproval ever could. The trouble began with Lady Marigold, the very woman under whose household Eleanor had originally served before coming to Ashworth Manor. She arrived unannounced one bitterly cold afternoon, her expression grave, requesting an urgent private audience with the Duke. Eleanor was not present for their initial conversation, occupied instead with the children's afternoon lessons, but she was summoned shortly afterward to the Duke's study, where she found both the Duke and Lady Marigold waiting, their expressions troubled in a way that immediately filled her with unease. "Eleanor, my dear," Lady Marigold said, rising to embrace her briefly, though her usual warmth was tempered now by evident distress. "I am afraid I bring difficult news." "What has happened, my lady?" Eleanor asked, her stomach already tightening with apprehension. Lady Marigold hesitated, glancing briefly toward the Duke before continuing. "The rumors surrounding your position here, and the Duke's public defense of you at Pemberton House, have reached the ears of certain individuals within society, whose opinions carry considerable weight. Specifically, they have reached Lord Ashworth's late father's closest associates, men who serve on the board overseeing several of the Duke's most significant business interests and estate holdings." Eleanor's confusion deepened. "I do not understand, my lady. What bearing does that have on the current matter?" The Duke's expression grew tight, and it was he who answered, his voice carefully controlled, despite the evident tension beneath it. "These men, Eleanor, hold considerable influence over certain financial and legal matters concerning my estate, matters established by my father's will, requiring their approval for various significant decisions, including matters of marriage, given the specific terms of certain family trusts." Eleanor's heart began to pound uncomfortably as she began to understand the shape of the difficulty before her. "And they disapprove, I take it, of the current situation." "They have made clear," Lady Marigold said gently, "that they view any serious attachment between the Duke and his children's governess as entirely unsuitable, and have threatened to contest certain provisions of the family trust, should such an attachment continue, potentially placing significant portions of the Ashworth estate, and by extension, Edmund and Cassandra's own inheritance, at considerable risk." The weight of this new complication settled heavily over Eleanor, far more serious than mere society gossip or Lady Pemberton's pointed warnings. This was not simply a matter of reputation, but of genuine, material consequence. Consequence that extended beyond herself and the Duke, to the very children she had grown to love, as though they were her own. "Your Grace," Eleanor said slowly, turning to face him directly, "surely this changes matters considerably." The Duke's expression was tight, with barely restrained frustration, though whether directed at the situation itself, or at some deeper internal conflict, Eleanor could not entirely tell. "It complicates matters, certainly, but it does not change my feelings, Eleanor, whatever difficulties it may present." "But Edmund and Cassandra's inheritance," Eleanor pressed, "their future security, surely that must take precedence over." "Over my own happiness?" The Duke interrupted, something sharp entering his tone now. "Over yours? Over practical necessity, Your Grace," Eleanor said, deliberately returning to his formal title, some old instinct urging caution now that such significant consequences hung in the balance. "The children's well-being must come first, always. You have taught me that yourself, through your own actions these past months." The Duke's jaw tightened, clearly recognizing the truth in her words, however unwelcome. "There must be some other course," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Some means of addressing the board's concerns without requiring—" "Without requiring what, Your Grace?" Eleanor asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer, and dreaded it deeply. He did not answer immediately, his gaze dropping briefly, before meeting hers again, something pained and reluctant in his expression. "Without requiring that we abandon what has grown between us," he said finally, though the words seemed to cost him considerable effort. Lady Marigold, who had remained quietly observant throughout this exchange, spoke gently into the tense silence that followed. There may yet be time to address the board's concerns properly, Your Grace, through careful negotiation, and perhaps some compromise regarding the trust's specific terms. But such matters require time and considerable diplomatic care, neither of which can be rushed without risking the very consequences we hope to avoid. How much time? Eleanor asked quietly. Weeks, perhaps months, Lady Marigold admitted. And even then, success is not guaranteed. The men involved are set in their views regarding matters of proper social position and may prove difficult to sway, regardless of careful diplomacy. Eleanor felt the weight of the situation pressing heavily upon her chest, torn between her own growing feelings for the Duke and her genuine concern for Edmund and Cassandra's future security. She thought of the two children upstairs, unaware of the complicated adult matters currently threatening their inheritance and stability, and felt a fierce, protective resolve settling over her own uncertain heart. Your Grace, she said finally, her voice steady despite the difficulty of what she was about to say. I believe, for now, we must exercise considerably greater caution than we have shown these past weeks. Whatever exists between us, it cannot be allowed to jeopardize Edmund and Cassandra's future, not while there remains any possibility of resolving the board's concerns through proper diplomatic means. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something conflicted and pained behind his sharp gaze. You would have us return to distance and careful pretense then, after everything we have already acknowledged between us. I would have us prioritize the children's well-being, Eleanor said firmly, though her own heart ached considerably at the necessity of the suggestion, while Lady Marigold and yourself work to resolve this matter properly. If, after such efforts, the board remains genuinely unmovable, then we shall face that difficulty when it arises. But I cannot, in good conscience, allow my own feelings to risk Edmund and Cassandra's future security, not when there remains a proper path forward that might avoid such risk entirely. The Duke's expression grew troubled, clearly torn between his own growing feelings and the practical wisdom of Eleanor's careful reasoning. You ask a great deal of me, Eleanor. I ask only what you yourself taught me to value, Your Grace, Eleanor replied gently. The well-being of those children, above all else. Lady Marigold, watching this exchange with evident sympathy, spoke gently once more. I will do everything within my power to help resolve this matter favorably, Your Grace. I have some influence of my own within these circles, and I do not believe the situation is entirely hopeless. But Miss Whitfield's caution, I believe, is wise, at least for the present time. The Duke remained silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with the difficult necessity being asked of him. Finally, he nodded slowly, though his expression remained heavy with reluctance. Very well, he said quietly. We shall proceed with caution, for the children's sake, while Lady Marigold works toward resolving the board's concerns. But I will not pretend, Eleanor, that this arrangement sits easily with me. Nor with me, Your Grace, Eleanor admitted softly, the ache in her own chest, entirely genuine, despite the necessity of her own careful reasoning. As Lady Marigold took her leave shortly afterward, promising to begin her diplomatic efforts immediately, Eleanor and the Duke remained alone in the quiet study, the weight of their difficult decisions settling heavily between them. I do not know how long I can continue pretending indifference toward you, Eleanor, the Duke admitted quietly, now that I have known what it feels like to acknowledge my true feelings openly. Nor I toward you, Alexander, Eleanor replied softly, allowing herself, in this private moment, the comfort of his given name once more. But we must try, for Edmund and Cassandra's sake, whatever difficulty it brings us personally. The Duke reached for her hand once more, holding it gently, despite the renewed distance they had just agreed to maintain publicly. Then, let us hope, Eleanor, that Lady Marigold's diplomatic efforts prove successful, and swiftly, for I do not know how long either of us can bear this particular sacrifice. Eleanor squeezed his hand gently in return, drawing what comfort she could from the quiet, private intimacy of the moment, even as she recognized the difficult weeks of careful distance and uncertain waiting that lay ahead of them both. 6 weeks passed in careful, quiet distance, each day feeling to Eleanor like a small trial of patience and restraint. She and the Duke maintained proper decorum in every visible interaction, their conversations returning to careful formality whenever servants or visitors might overhear, their private moments together growing rare and brief, snatched only in careful, quiet corners of the manor when circumstances allowed. It was not easy for either of them. Eleanor noticed the toll it took on the Duke, the tension that had crept back into his shoulders, the careful blankness he wore now in company, so different from the warmth she had glimpsed in him over recent months. She felt her own heart aching with the same quiet strain, though she did her best to hide it from the children, who remained blessedly unaware of the complicated adult matters unfolding around them. Lady Marigold, true to her word, worked diligently behind the scenes, using her considerable social connections and careful diplomacy to address the board's concerns. She wrote to Eleanor occasionally, with careful updates, though progress seemed frustratingly slow, the men involved proving every bit as stubborn and set in their views as she had originally feared. It was in early February, during one particularly harsh winter storm that kept the entire household confined indoors for nearly a week, that matters finally came to a head in a manner none of them had anticipated. The trouble began with Edmund, who had grown increasingly perceptive over the months since their arrival at Ashworth Manor, and who had clearly noticed the careful distance that had settled once more between Eleanor and the Duke, despite their best efforts to conceal it from the children. "Why do you and His Grace no longer speak at supper the way you used to?" Edmund asked one evening, catching Eleanor alone in the schoolroom, as she prepared the following day's lessons. Eleanor felt her chest tighten at the unexpected directness of his question. "I am not certain what you mean, Edmund. His Grace and I speak at supper every evening." "Not the way you used to," Edmund pressed, his sharp eyes studying her carefully, far too perceptive for his 11 years. "You used to laugh together. Now you barely look at each other." Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal to a child, however perceptive, about matters so complicated and delicate. "Sometimes adults must be careful about certain things, Edmund, for reasons that are not always simple to explain." "Is it because of what happened at Lady Pemberton's gathering?" Edmund asked, surprising her further with his awareness. "The servants talk about it, you know. They think I do not hear, but I do." Eleanor sighed softly, recognizing that further evasion would serve little purpose with a boy as observant as Edmund had become. "It is complicated, Edmund. There are matters concerning your father's estate and your own inheritance that require careful handling. His Grace and I must be cautious, for your sake and Cassandra's, until those matters are properly resolved." Edmund considered this for a long moment, his young face troubled with a thoughtfulness beyond his years. "Is it because you and His Grace care for each other more than you should, given your position?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm slightly at the boy's directness, though she could not bring herself to deny what he had so plainly observed. "Something like that, yes," she admitted quietly. "I do not understand why that should matter," Edmund said, frowning. "You have made him happier these past months than I have ever seen him, and you have helped me more than anyone, since Papa died. Why should something good need to be hidden away like a secret shame?" Eleanor felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion at the boy's simple, heartfelt observation. "The world is not always fair, Edmund, nor simple, in matters of position and propriety. But I promise you, whatever happens, my care for you and Cassandra will never change." Edmund nodded slowly, though his troubled expression suggested he remained unconvinced that such complicated adult matters truly needed to stand in the way of genuine happiness. It was this very conversation, relayed later that evening by Edmund himself during a rare moment alone with the Duke, that finally prompted the confrontation that would determine the course of Eleanor and the Duke's future together. Eleanor was summoned to the Duke's study late that same evening, well after the children had retired for the night, Mrs. Whitmore delivering the request with a curious, knowing expression that suggested she too had begun to suspect the true nature of the tension within the household. She found the Duke standing near the fire, his expression more resolute than she had seen in weeks, something decided and firm behind his sharp gaze as she entered. "You wish to see me, Your Grace?" she asked carefully, closing the door behind her. "Edmund spoke with me tonight," the Duke said without preamble, "about matters concerning yourself and myself, and the careful distance we have maintained these past weeks." Eleanor felt a flicker of unease. "Your Grace, I hope he has not caused you undue distress with his observations." "On the contrary," the Duke said, turning to face her fully now, something fierce and determined in his expression. "He has caused me a great deal of clarity, Eleanor, regarding a matter I fear I have allowed to remain unresolved for far too long." "Your Grace?" "He asked me," the Duke continued, his voice growing steadier with each word, "why something good should need to be hidden away like shame, and I found, try as I might, I could not give him a satisfactory answer." Eleanor's heart began to pound with cautious, uncertain hope. "What are you saying, Alexander?" "I am saying," the Duke replied, closing the distance between them with deliberate steps, "that I have grown considerably tired of waiting for permission from men who care nothing for genuine happiness, only for the careful preservation of social position and appearance. I have allowed caution and practical necessity to dictate my heart for 6 long weeks, Eleanor, and I find I can no longer continue doing so." "But the board," Eleanor said, though her voice carried less conviction now than it once had. "Edmund and Cassandra's inheritance." "Lady Marigold sent word only this morning," the Duke interrupted gently. "The board's primary objection, it seems, was never truly about propriety at all, but rather concern regarding the stability and management of the estate, should my personal circumstances change significantly. Once she demonstrated, through careful diplomacy, that my judgment and management of the estate remains entirely sound, regardless of my personal attachments, their objections began to soften considerably." Eleanor felt a rush of relief and disbelief flooding through her chest. "Truly?" "Truly," the Duke confirmed, a genuine, unguarded smile finally breaking through his careful composure. "There remain some formalities to be settled, certain assurances regarding the estate's continued proper management, but Lady Marigold believes, and I agree, that the board's objections can be satisfactorily resolved within a matter of weeks, provided we proceed with appropriate care and diplomacy." "Then we need not maintain such careful distance any longer?" Eleanor asked, scarcely daring to believe the sudden shift in their circumstances. "We need not," the Duke confirmed, reaching for her hands and holding them gently in his own. "Though I confess, Eleanor, I find myself unwilling to wait, even those few remaining weeks, before telling you plainly what I should have told you long before tonight." "What is that, Your Grace?" Eleanor asked softly, though something in his expression already told her the answer. "That I love you," the Duke said simply, the words carrying a quiet, genuine conviction, entirely unlike his usual careful, measured tone. "Completely, and without reservation, regardless of position or propriety, or any obstacle society may yet place before us. I have spent my entire life believing that control was the only thing standing between order and chaos, Eleanor, and yet you are the one thing I have never been able to control, no matter how diligently I tried. And I find, standing here now, that I do not wish to control this particular feeling any longer. I simply wish to embrace it, fully and openly, for as long as you will allow me to." Eleanor felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, the weight of 6 weeks of careful restraint finally giving way to the overwhelming warmth of his open, heartfelt declaration. "I love you as well, Alexander," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, with the depth of emotion finally being given voice after so many weeks of careful silence. "I have for quite some time now, though I confess I have tried, much as you did, to convince myself otherwise, for the sake of practical caution." "And has that practical caution served either of us particularly well?" the Duke asked, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "Not particularly, no," Eleanor admitted, unable to suppress her own answering smile. The Duke reached up gently, cupping her cheek with careful tenderness. "Then let us set caution aside, Eleanor, at least where matters of the heart are concerned. I cannot promise the path ahead will be entirely without difficulty. Society may yet prove slow to accept our circumstances, and there will likely be further obstacles requiring careful navigation. But I find I would rather face those difficulties openly, with you beside me, than continue hiding behind careful pretense and quiet suffering." "Nor would I wish it any other way, Alexander," Eleanor replied softly, leaning into his gentle touch. In the weeks that followed, Lady Marigold's careful diplomacy proved successful, the board's objections gradually softening, as the Duke demonstrated, through continued sound management of his estate and careful, respectful courtship of Eleanor, that his judgment remained entirely trustworthy, despite his personal attachment to his children's former governess. Society's gossip, too, gradually shifted, particularly once word spread of the genuine, heartfelt nature of their attachment. Many who had once whispered disapproval, finding themselves won over by the evident happiness and quiet dignity with which both the Duke and Eleanor conducted themselves. Edmund and Cassandra, for their part, greeted the news of their guardian's genuine happiness with unrestrained joy, Cassandra in particular, delighting in the prospect of Eleanor becoming a permanent, beloved fixture within their small family. rather than simply their governess. Edmund, whose perceptive observations had ultimately helped prompt the Duke's final resolution, took quiet pride in having played some small part in bringing about such a happy resolution. Their wedding took place in early spring, a modest but joyful ceremony held in the manor's own small chapel, the very place where Eleanor had once witnessed the Duke's private grief over his mother's passing. It seemed a fitting location, in its own quiet way, for a new chapter to begin, honoring the past while embracing a future neither of them had expected to find, particularly not with each other. Standing together before the small gathering of family and close friends, Eleanor found herself thinking back to that very first evening at the ball, so many months before, when the Duke's cold warning had first frozen her in place, uncertain and afraid. She had never imagined, in that uncertain moment, that such a beginning could lead to this, to genuine love, hard-won through patience, courage, and the willingness of two guarded hearts to finally set aside their careful defenses. "Do you remember," she whispered to him quietly, as they exchanged their vows, "the very first thing you ever said to me?" The Duke's eyes crinkled with genuine warmth at the memory. "Do not challenge me," he murmured back, just for her ears, and you nearly froze on the spot. "I did," Eleanor admitted with a soft laugh, "though I confess, even then, some part of me suspected you were not quite so unyielding as you wished the world to believe. You saw through me rather easily, even then," the Duke replied, echoing words he had once spoken to her in the quiet chapel months before. "It seems, Eleanor, you have made rather a habit of seeing past my careful defenses. Perhaps," Eleanor said softly, "because you allowed me to, even when you yourself were not yet ready to acknowledge it." The Duke squeezed her hands gently, his expression carrying none of the careful, guarded composure that had once defined him so completely to the rest of the world. "Whatever the reason, Eleanor, I find myself profoundly grateful for it. You have taught me that genuine strength lies not in controlling every circumstance and feeling, but in having the courage to embrace what truly matters, regardless of the risk it carries." As their small gathering celebrated the joyful union that followed, Eleanor could not help but reflect on how far they had both traveled since that first, frozen moment at the ball. The Duke of Ashworth, once known throughout society for his unshakable control and cold, careful composure, had faced the one thing he could never truly command, his own heart, and rather than fighting against it any longer, had finally chosen to embrace it fully, with open, genuine courage. And Eleanor, who had once frozen beneath the weight of his quiet warning, had found in its place something far more precious than she had ever anticipated. Not fear, but genuine partnership, built on mutual respect, hard-won understanding, and a love strong enough to weather every obstacle society had placed before it. Their story, unlikely as its beginning had been, had become something far greater than either of them could have imagined that first cold evening. Proof, perhaps, that even the most carefully guarded hearts could learn, given time and courage, to open fully to genuine, lasting love.